In 2024, if you were on eBay and you typed South Bend into the search bar, what company would you guess dominates those search results displayed more than all of the others? South Bend Toy Company? Good guess, but no. South Bend Watch Company? Another good guess. Also no. South Bend Lathe? Now we're getting somewhere. There is a lot of South Bend Lathe stuff out there, good for second place on our list. But there's one more company ahead of South Bend Lathe, and it's way ahead of South Bend Lathe. That company is South Bend Bait, and its collector's items are all over the auction site, with more up for bid than every other South Bend company combined. Maybe you want a red and gold pike or reno lure for $2.99. There are lots of these available. Or how about a 6-foot bamboo rod for $200? Maybe you're in the market for the really rare stuff. Can I interest you in a 3.5-inch underwater hex minnow lure from the year 1914? Buy it now for just $900. Yeah, I know that's a lot of money. And I understand if you want to pause the podcast right now to go rifle through your dad's old tackle box. But when you get back, we're going fishing. And we're going to use some of the most incredible lures ever made, courtesy of the South Bend Bait Company. Hello, and welcome to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum in South Bend. I'm your host, Aaron Helman, and during this series, we're going to dive into some of the fun and forgotten businesses of South Bend, running the gamut from toys to bait to underwear to newspapers. During the course of this episode, you'll hear fictional advertisements for very real historical companies and products. We do that to help break up the podcast, provide some levity, to include just a little more history than we could otherwise, and to give you a sense of the time and place when and where all of this is happening. The absence of actual paid advertisements is made possible by the generous underwriting of the entire series by Andy and Tina Nickel of South Bend. And now, with all that out of the way, let's push off from the boat launch and start fishing for a story. This one starts with a mystery. The history of the South Bend Bait Company starts in 1896 with a fellow named Frank G. Worden. But pretty much everyone who knew him just called him Bucktail. Bucktail Worden arrived in South Bend sometime before 1896. We don't know where he came from, but we know he arrived as an agent of the Grand Union Tea Company and was the manager of that company's first South Bend brick-and-mortar store when it opened at 129 South Michigan Street on August 7, 1897. But even by the time he opened the shop, Worden was already famous around town for something else. He was one of the best fishermen in South Bend, largely thanks to his handmade baits. His secret? Tying hair from a deer's tail right onto the hooks, and now you know how he earned his nickname. We're not entirely sure when Worden started making them or when he started selling them, but in June 1897, the first ads for his handiwork appeared in the paper. A local shop called Ryder's was selling Worden's bucktail baits for 10 cents apiece. It extolled the virtues of that deer hair-covered hook that skips along the surface of the water and presents an enticing lunch to the wily bass, causing them to bite most eagerly. Business was good enough that within 4 years, he had left the tea company and was in the bait business full-time. In 1901, he established the Worden Bait Company, and during the next few years, his business started to earn acclaim among sportsmen all over the United States. Ads for Worden bucktails appeared in Fort Wayne, Minneapolis, and Kansas City. He included his baits in an exhibition at the St. Louis World's Fair. By the end of 1903, he was also selling rods. Worden did a decent business in those early years, but it was not a booming one. More often than not, it was a one-man show. During the peak season, he would hire on one or two extra hands on a temporary basis, almost always women, employed to help paint the completed baits. Worden only manufactured baits to order and did not keep an inventory on hand. One of those women, Elizabeth Hecht, remembered that during especially slow times, the staff would visit 5-cent movies to kill time while they waited for coats of paint to dry. Bucktail Worden was known in fishing circles as an excellent bait maker. He was not known as an excellent businessman. He made a few missteps in those early years, licensing other companies to produce his designs, and probably not selling those rights for as much as he should have. In the years before companies like Xerox and Google ferociously defended their trademarks, the Worden name became diluted almost as soon as the company was founded. Worden was the name of his company, yes, but it was also a generic term used to describe a certain style of bait. In order to make the company a success, he was going to need some outside help. He was going to need investors, and he was going to need advisors. On March 29, 1905, the Worden Bucktail Company was incorporated. The directors of the company included Worden and his wife Molly, and brothers Jay and Adam Scheidler of the Scheidler Hardware Company. In 1906, Jacob Kuntz, owner of the South Bend Dowel Works, bought significant shares of the company. He moved the Bucktail Company into the second floor of his own factory, and by the end of the year, Worden was overseeing 10 employees and beginning to realize his first significant profits. But exactly when his business life was going great, his personal life was falling apart. In December 1906, just 2 days after Christmas, Bucktail Worden drained his bank accounts and left town with his mistress, abandoning his wife and their young child. He was discovered a few months later in Sandusky, Ohio, after a fight with the mistress turned ugly, and she reported him to the police. When word of the arrest reached South Bend, Molly Worden was on the first train to Ohio, where she confronted her husband at the Sandusky jail. Bucktail Worden broke down in sobbing apologies and begged his wife to take him back. She agreed on the one condition that he sign all of his property and accounts over to her. He quickly acquiesced, and the pair returned to South Bend. But not for long. Now charged with ownership of Worden's possessions, Molly held a massive estate sale, selling off all of their furniture and housewares before selling the house. Then, she sold their stake in the company. Bucktail, Molly, and their son boarded a train bound for New York and were never heard from again. Where they went and what they did is a history mystery yet to be solved. Back in South Bend, with Worden out of the picture, that meant that Jacob Kuntz was fully in charge of operations, and his first move was to change the company's name. The new name was the South Bend Bait Company, designed to distance itself from its scandalous former owner and to make sure customers knew that it sold a lot more than just bucktail lures. By 1910, it had added wooden minnows, fish hooks, and was increasing its production of rods and reels. The strategy didn't pay off. Sales dropped to just $7,300 by the end of 1910. It was down to just 4 employees, and Kuntz sold the company off to a quartet of South Benders named Fred Dennis, F.A. Bryan, Malcolm Carrington, and Burton Oliver. They made Oliver the manager, and don't let the name confuse you. Burton Oliver was not a part of the Oliver family that made plows in South Bend. Anyway, with Kuntz out of the picture, the relationship with his dowel company soured, and the South Bend Bait Company moved out of the second floor of the dowel factory and into the old Tut building at the corner of Lafayette and Colfax. It was barely more than a house, and it was probably still more space than the company needed. Heading into 1911, South Bend Bait was teetering. Worden hadn't been the right manager. Neither had Kuntz, neither had Oliver. South Bend Bait needed to find the right guy, and quickly. It wasn't going to have many more chances. After the break, We'll meet the man who saved the fledgling operation and turned South Bend Bait Company into a $1 million company with a worldwide footprint.
How would a full-jeweled typewriter appeal to you? L.C. Smith's full-jeweled typewriters prevent play, banish friction, and ensure a full equivalent of perfect work. You demand a full-jeweled watch. Why not a full-jeweled typewriter? Visit the L.C. Smith Typewriter Company today at 219 South Main Street and be convinced of the quality. And now back to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum.
The greatest managerial move that Burton Oliver ever made was recognizing that he was not cut out to be South Bend Bait Company's manager. After less than a year, the board installed a new man to run operations, a credit manager transplanted from Chicago, originally born in Sweden. His name was Ivar Hennings. He'd never run a factory, but what he lacked in experience he made up for in passion and knowledge for the industry. By the time his tenure ended, Hennings would make himself and a lot of other people rich, and he would become one of the most important conservationists in Indiana. Hennings sent right to work putting the company on the map, taking out ads in fishing publications and getting the firm's baits and lures in front of fishermen all over the United States. Growth was slow for a few years, but it was steady, and it was growth. By 1915, Hennings bought out the 4 owners who'd hired him on. That same year, he introduced the company's first catalog and shipped it to sporting goods stores in the United States and Canada. A year after that, Hennings made his most important business move, buying a patent from a Benton Harbor fisherman named James Olds. The bait was called the Bassarino, and it was quickly established as the best way to catch North America's favorite fish. The Bassarino would become the first lure in the world to reach 1 million in sales. By 1917, Hennings had been successful in doing the impossible. Sales, revenues, and profits had grown 10 times over in just 6 years. South Bend Bait employed 50 hired hands, mostly women. Its products were shipped throughout the United States, Canada, and Europe. In the wake of the wildly successful Bassarinos, it introduced a whole line of Areno baits. The South Bend Bait Company put out 2 million pieces in 1917, and every single one of them was stamped with 2 words, South Bend. The company was only getting started. In 1919, South Bend Bait bought out the shuttered Miller Knobloch Wagon Works on High Street, then filed paperwork to increase its issuance of capital stock from $25,000 to $250,000. By the end of 1920, the retrofit of the wagon works was complete, and the South Bend Bait Company was established in its long-term home at 1108 South High Street and armed with a war chest of cash that had previously seemed unimaginable. The famous South Bend Areno baits became known by hundreds of thousands of anglers the country over as the greatest fish getters made. The Bassarino was without question the most popular wood bait made anywhere for bass and other game fishing, the Muscarino for musky fishing, the Troutarino for trout fishing, the Tarparino for tarpons, and the Trollarino, which, despite its name, was not used to catch trolls. Between 1917 and 1921, business increased another 5 times over. South Bend Bait shipped 10 million pieces in 1921, and Hennings' professional life could not have gone any better. Unfortunately, his personal life was falling apart. In September 1921, Hennings' wife was sued for seducing away a married man during what the newspapers called a liquor party. The suit was for $5,000, an amount equivalent to $90,000 in 2024. By the end of the year, Hennings was divorced. He poured himself even more into his work, and he was not the last divorced man to fill his empty time with thoughts of fishing. South Bend bait was growing as fast as Hennings could make it grow. The 1922 acquisition of Cross Rod and Tackle brought bamboo rods into the company's product line. In June of 1923, the firm received a single order for 6,171 miles of fishing line. Hennings launched a coast-to-coast advertising campaign that would be seen by more than 28 million people. His advertising efforts had been wildly successful, but the best was yet to come. In November of 1925, the South Bend Tribune's literary critic ran a column extolling the work of a relatively unknown short story writer out of Chicago, a fellow called Ernest Hemingway. The last line of that review recommended that Ivar Hennings bring Hemingway on as an ad copy writer at the South Bend Bait Company. If Hemingway was ever actually offered the job, he didn't take it. But if it's at all possible, the guy the company got instead might have been even better. You probably don't know who Cal Johnson is, and I certainly didn't when I started writing the script for this podcast. But during the first half of the 20th century, he was arguably the greatest fisherman in the United States, and was almost certainly the premier outdoors writer of his time. By the end of his career, he would become fishing editor for the magazine Sports Afield, host TV and radio shows, and lead fishing trips for two alliterative American presidents, Calvin Coolidge and Herbert Hoover. Depending on who you ask, Cal Johnson might still hold the world record for catching the largest muskie. Using a South Bend Bait Company lure, he hauled in a 67-pounder in 1949 and made headlines across the country for the feat. But in 1926, before he climbed to all of those lofty heights, he was living at 612 East Broadway Street in South Bend and working as an ad writer for the South Bend Bait Company. Johnson's marketing efforts were truly and exquisitely groundbreaking for their time. The company started producing motion pictures that would help market its lures and promote the outdoors, helping to establish the genre of travel film. The effort paid off, and in 1928, South Bend Bait crossed $1 million in sales, employed 400 people, and sold its wares in all 48 states and in 26 countries. As South Bend Bait rose in stature, so too did Ivar Hennings. In 1929, he was elected president of the Indiana chapter of the Isaac Walton League, and in 1930, he was elected vice president of the Associated Fishing Tackle Manufacturers. He helped to write some of the same codes that are used today to govern the industry, and began to throw his weight around on a national and international scale. But back in South Bend, the employees of the South Bend Bait Company were even more revered. Not only were they making some of the best lures on the planet, but oftentimes they were also the best fishermen that anyone knew. The goings-on in the factory and at the offices were treated with real reverence by the outside world, and they were treated as such by the South Bend Tribune in 1930. On a more or less quiet street, so far as traffic is concerned, but shoulder to shoulder with one of the noisy railroads here is the South Bend Bait Company, where fish-minded citizens are continually scratching their heads and devising ways and means of inventing some new contraption to attract the wily members of the Finny tribe. Of course, the 1930s also brought a Great Depression, but this was only a hiccup for the workers at the bait factory. The Great Depression didn't hit their industry as badly as it did many others. In fact, the rampant unemployment of the era might have been a boon for the South Bend Bait Company, giving men more time to fish and pinning the fortunes of family dinners on their success on the water. In 1935, right in the middle of that depression, South Bend Bait bought up some of the old bird cell factory for further expansion. That year, it sold 4 million yards of fishing line, 1.2 million lures, and 140,000 reels. During the Depression, Ivar Hennings went on a fishing trip with Grantland Rice that was recounted in newspapers across the country. Hennings also moved to a fine house at 2419 East Jefferson, where the Logan Center sits as of 2025. Hennings would mediate a pair of worker strikes in 1937, and then, once everyone was back to work and production was resumed, Hennings began to focus on even bigger ventures than his company. In 1940, he removed himself from the presidency of South Bend Bait, took a position as chairman of the board, and assigned Harold Stream to take over his place. The newspapers had a lot of fun making puns about how Stream had taken over the fishing company. During the coming years, Hennings would become the national president of the Isaac Walton League and would serve an appointment on the Indiana Conservation Commission. All the while, he remained an active advertiser and spokesperson for South Bend Bait, going on extravagant fishing trips all over the world, filming his adventures and using them to help sell lures. If he sold enough, he'd have enough money to fund another advertising adventure. For a lot of people, Hennings was living the greatest life they could imagine, getting paid well to travel all over the world fishing. Bait production was brought to a halt during World War II, but South Bend Bait kept its workers busy, serving as a subcontractor for major wartime producers, especially the Bendix Corporation. And then, as soon as the war ended, South Bend increased its capital stock to a cool $1 million and opened 2 more manufacturing facilities in Iowa. In March of 1949, Hennings was inducted into the inaugural class of the Fishing Hall of Fame. He wouldn't have much time to celebrate his accomplishment. A year later, in 1950, Ivar Hennings was shockingly dead. South Bend Bait had lost its leader and its visionary. But worst of all, it had lost its soul. We'll get into all of it right after the break.
Hey kiddies, come on, climb aboard! We're taking a trip to the North Pole on the Santa Claus Streamliner, the new miniature electric train at Sears Roebuck & Company, located at Western and Lafayette. The Santa Claus Streamliner is a real beauty, driven by a real engineer, and you can ride for just 9 cents. And now, back to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum.
South Bend was dumbfounded at the loss of Ivar Hennings, and the South Bend Bait Company even more so. Hennings was not the founder of the company, nor was he its first or second or even its third owner, but he was absolutely the one who delivered it to prominence. The company's success had been his own. Ivar Hennings died with an estate valued at $409,000. More than $5 million in 2024 dollars. In the aftermath of Hennings' death, work at the company began to change, and not always for the better. Production of all lures and hooks were sent off to Iowa, where land was cheap, and factories weren't landlocked the way they were on High Street in South Bend. Iowa also took on production of all of the company's fiberglass rods. By the end of 1950, the only thing still produced in South Bend were bamboo rods, and that product line was phased out a few years later. That meant South Bend was the corporate home for a company that carried its name, but that all those pieces stamped with the words South Bend weren't actually produced there. South Bend Bait continued to run its marketing machine, running promotional photos with Cleveland Indian stars Bob Feller and Al Rosen. It released the film Fabulous Fishin' in South America, a movie that is still findable and watchable today. It unveiled a brand new lure it called the Super Duper. Harold Stream announced that the company would deliver more than 100,000 Super Dupers each year. And yes, that's a weird way to say 1 million. At the end of 1954, Harold Stream retired to the position of chairman of the board, and a fellow named William C. Martindale took his place as president. Martindale was in charge of making the choice to rename the firm as South Bend Tackle in 1955, a decision that was equally defensible and damaging. In the early 1900s, the word bait was used to refer to anything that a person might use to seduce a fish onto a hook. By the middle part of the century, the word bait was most likely to be used in reference to live bait, worms, crickets. It was with that understanding that Martindale changed the company's name to South Bend Tackle. But instead of eliminating confusion, he might have created it. Every fisherman in the country and many fishermen across the world already knew what South Bend bait was. An established audience of millions didn't need the explanation that the firm sold lures and not worms. The company had a well-established and recognizable brand. Now it had a new name, and maybe the board didn't like that move either. Martindale was out after less than 2 years at the helm, replaced by Gerald Brooks in 1957. The newspapers had a lot of fun with his last name, too. Brooks' tenure was even shorter. He oversaw the premiere of another pair of fishing films in 1958, Canoeing for Trout and Action in Idaho. But before that year was over, South Bend Tackle had been bought out by Seymour and Benjamin Foreman, the same Chicago brothers who would also buy out South Bend Toy Company and South Bend Tool and Die. All three were in the same boat, and all three were going to suffer the same fate. The Foremans appointed Seymour as the new president and general manager, then moved the company's headquarters to Chicago. By the end of 1958, South Bend Tackle did not have any presence in South Bend. Its stuff was made in Iowa and sold and marketed in Chicago. The Foremans announced $3 million worth of sales in 1961, and then they got bored. The Foreman brothers moved to Los Angeles and appointed a fellow named H.S. Bernstein to run South Bend Tackle. Bernstein, in turn, announced that he was moving the headquarters back to South Bend, along with all of its manufacturing. Factories in Iowa were shut down, and on October 10, 1962, South Bend Tackle was a South Bend company all over again. But it's possible that the damage had already been done. The Foremans signed a convoluted set of production and licensing deals before they stepped away from the company. The kinds of deals that made them good money in the short run, without too much worry about the company's long-term tenability. They licensed other manufacturers to produce South Bend lures with the South Bend name, and at the same time, they signed South Bend Tackle up to make private label products for Sears and Montgomery Ward that didn't carry the South Bend name. Once the company was reestablished in South Bend, it was facing down a branding nightmare. It spent a lot of time and money making products that didn't have its name on them, and a lot of the products that did have the name probably weren't produced there. The Foremans bought a company with a strong brand and a loyal following, and in 4 years, they left it almost totally diluted. They found a way to convert goodwill and public sentiment into cold, hard cash. In 1964, the floundering company was repurchased again, this time by B.F. Gladding. Gladding announced plans to totally end all production at the South Bend factory on July 2, 1965. 90 workers lost their jobs that day. 75 of them were women. Gladding didn't last long after that, and for a short time the South Bend part of its operations were picked up by a company in Oregon. That didn't last either. In 1980, a separate company with a similar name was launched in Chicago. South Bend Sporting Goods was an attempt to recapture some of that South Bend magic, and it seems to have worked. South Bend, the two words stand alone now, is now a subsidiary of Calcutta Outdoors. Their tagline claims a lineage since 1906, and it's not certain what event in that year the tagline is referring to. Hey, thanks for joining us on A Bend in Time presented by the History Museum in South Bend. There's more history waiting for you at historymuseumsb.org. I'm your host, Aaron Helman. The theme music is Whose Distance Is It Anyway by Neil Carmichael. Thanks to Andy and Tina Nickel for underwriting this episode and all 8 episodes in this series. Our next episode in the Forgotten Businesses series will cover the South Bend Toy Company, and I hope you'll tune in for that one next. Until then, keep learning new things, and remember, everything is fascinating as long as you stay curious.